Welcome to the Constitution at Work podcast, where we discuss issues affecting the Constitution and our democracy. I'm Daniela Ellerbeck, an attorney and the manager of the F.W. de Klerk Foundation's Constitutional Rights Program. Joining me today is Lusanda Mahkuntsu, the Constitutional Rights Program's new intern. Now, today, we're diving into the 14-day window that the Constitution gives to form a national government. Joining me as someone who's been at the coalface of South African politics for decades is Tony Leon, the former leader of the DA and South Africa's longest-serving opposition leader. Today, we'll explore what the GNU's formation in those 14 days revealed about our constitution, South Africa's political culture, and the future of coalition governance. This is a conversation you don't want to miss. Tony, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much, Daniela. Nice to be with you.
Let's dive straight into the 14 days limit. Now, the Constitution gives the nation 14 days to form a government after the IEC declares the election results. Specifically, Section 51(1) of the Constitution states that, and I quote, after an election, the first sitting of the National Assembly, so that is Parliament, must take place at a time and on a date determined by the Chief Justice, but not more than 14 days after the election results have been declared. Now, as viewers will know, the sitting of Parliament is crucial because it's where the new Parliament is sworn in, Parliament Speaker and Deputy Speaker are elected, and Parliament elects the new President. So let's start with the 14 days. The clock to finalize negotiations must start the moment the results are known. Tony, from your experience in the 2024 GNU negotiations, do you think this time frame is realistic for such high-stakes coalition building, or does it risk rushing critical decisions?
Well, as they say in the classics, where you stand on issue depends on where you sit. And as you might know, a few months ago, 3 months ago, I published a new book called Being There, Backstories from the Political Front. And in it, among other topics, including incidentally, a reappraisal on your founder, F.W. de Klerk, I kept a diary of those negotiations day by day. And the first 14 days, of course, is as you describe it, was between the declaration of the election result and the first sitting of Parliament and the election of the president. On my issue of where you stand on this issue, depending on where you sit, it suited the ANC extremely well to have a concentrated pressure cooker environment, because they thought, well, and not just they thought, it was quite clear, and I elaborate in the book on the tactics of delay, non-arrival, rechanging the draft agreements right through until the early morning of the 14th of June for the first sitting of Parliament, because they thought, well, the longer they wait and the more they delay matters, the more pressure they're going to put on the other negotiating parties. And as I reference in the book, pertaining to my earlier experience when I was involved quite heavily in the 1991-1996 constitutional negotiations, that was the ANC's classic play then. So the constitutional finery is one thing, the realpolitik is another. But as to the general proposition of 14 days, well, I suppose it really was put in to the original constitution or the current constitution as a formality, because I don't think it was ever envisaged we'd be in such a fractured polity as we are as a consequence of the 2024 election results, or indeed the consequence of the ANC's malperformance in government after 30 years, which led to that election result. So I don't think, it was thought, well, we're going to need 3 or 4 months to negotiate because there won't be negotiations. One party is always going to prevail at the polls with our proportional representation system. And indeed, if you go back in South Africa's history, when we had a partial democracy in the sense it was restricted to minorities, whites, coloreds, and Indians at the end, not blacks, obviously the tricameral. In those days, you had between 1948 and 1994, 46 years of uninterrupted national party, one-party rule. And then between 1994 and last year's election, you had one-party, unaffected one-party rule, ANC style, with all the maladies and all the maladministrations and the misgovernance that comes from a one-party dominant system. But, constitutions are not drawn for every future contingency. They're drawn with the sort of known or estimated facts at the time of the inking. So I don't think this was, as I recall, and I'm sure the records of CODESA or the multi-party negotiation process will confirm, that this was a heavily contested clause at all. It was just thought, well, this is more formality. So that's why we've got it. It's certainly, given the recent experience, not just of the National Coalition, although it's not really a coalition, it's the ANC with a few additives carrying on as the ANC did before. But in any event, I certainly think it should be reviewed because, as you will know, the other examples in the world of coalition bargaining often take weeks and months. Now, that's not always true, of course. That might be true in continental Europe. In the United Kingdom, when they had to form a coalition government for the first time since the Second World War in 2010 between the Conservatives and the Liberal Democrats, there was very little time before the first meeting of Parliament, and they negotiated a pretty comprehensive agreement which stuck. I think, though, and we can perhaps canvass this further in this discussion, you can have any kind of agreement. If we'd had a bells and whistles, belt and braces, perhaps to mix my cliches, agreement governing this GNU, it wouldn't really have mattered, even if we'd hammered out every last point, because the evidence over the last 14 months since this GNU was inaugurated is that the ANC, at any event, has little interest or concern in regarding itself bound by the written undertakings that it gave in terms of the statement of intent, which, of course, had to be signed, at least from the DA point of view, before the DA agreed to elect Ramaphosa as president of South Africa. So that was a tussle right through to the last minute when Parliament was meeting, and we thought we had an agreement. We did have an agreement. We signed an agreement, and it's really not been honored in practice, but only in the breach since then.
How does the pressure to form a coalition within 2 weeks impact the stability of the resulting government?
Well, I'm not sure it has any effect on the stability of the resulting government in the sense that there was, or there still is, theoretically, an agreement on how the government will be stabilized. There are a whole lot of clauses which were carefully and negotiated, saying if there's a disagreement, if there's a lack of consensus, then there are going to be certain conflict resolution mechanisms. There's going to be certain deadlock breaking mechanisms, which essentially means that the two largest parties in this particular government have to agree to achieve what is called sufficient consensus, which itself is a holdover from the CODESA period of negotiations. But the conduct of the governing parties since the agreement has, I think, militated against that outcome.
Leading on from that, I know that trying to stabilize coalition politics has been the subject of numerous bills in the last calendar year. And much of the debate has been around, should there be enforcement mechanisms? How binding should coalition agreements be? What enforcement mechanisms do you see being suitable, if any, especially given what you've just highlighted about the fact that you can have the best agreement in the world, but if the parties don't stick to it, then it doesn't matter?
Going back to my book, Being There, Backstories from the Political Front, I reprise in it a conversation I had with one of the most eminent lawyers in South Africa, Michael Katz, who phoned me the day after the election of the president and the agreement had been signed just before then by the DA and the ANC. And he said very presciently and perceptibly, he said, look, you cannot go to court in order to enforce this agreement. This agreement is a political agreement. It depends on the attitude and conduct of the political parties to it. And I don't think there's been very much good faith at all in the operationalization of this GNU. So, we could add in pages of clauses and conditions and eventualities, but I'm not sure it's going to make a huge difference if the outcome is going to be determined by behavior or misbehavior of politicians who are trying to get some kind of advantage. I think that's the reality of the situation. The ultimate weapon is, once again, political, and that has legal consequences. So the political weapon for the dissenting party, if it says, we mistreated or the agreement's being dishonored, is to leave the coalition. And then an extremist to take the step that is contemplated in the constitution itself, and that is to bring a motion of no confidence against the president, in which case you have to go back to square one. So if it passes, of course. I think the broad mechanisms are there, and I don't want to repeat myself, but I don't think the legal clauses are going to change the political realities in the event of political malpractice, which I think we've seen rather a lot of here in the last few months.
Do you think Section 51(1) forces parties into temporary or unstable deals just to meet the deadline?
Well, clearly it does. Maybe it doesn't in an ideal set of circumstances, in an ideal situation. We don't have either of those here, where parties would actually, enter into agreements, reach a consensus, and then agree to be bound by them. Well, we've seen the exact opposite here. But, the 14 days is a limitation. But, I just go back to my original point. I think we've had 3 months and we've had more clauses or more agreements or more disagreements. I think it's the behavior after you've signed the agreement or entered the coalition that is determinative, not deadlines, real or artificial, constitutional or informal.
Tony, do you have any suggestions on how to change the attitudes?
I don't think voters are going to vote because of the behavior or the good behavior or the misbehavior of parties in the GNU. There's a lot of blame gaming going around, but I think people, vote for a range of reasons. So, I'm not sure that's determinative. Look, clearly, the ANC behavior, they are the largest minority party, but they are the drivers of the government. They have the presidency, they've got most of the ministries. The ANC's behavior tends to be more reasonable and more bargain-based when they're in imminent danger of losing a vote, never mind an election. But we saw that over this budget wrangle. The ANC awarded itself, and you can say the DA went along with it, which it did, so maybe they've got, with a vast over-representation of itself in the GNU, in terms of got far more cabinet seats than its proportional vote entitled it to. But the one thing that they don't control is the allocation of seats in Parliament itself, where the election result determines how many MPs each party gets. And that's where being a 40% party, sometimes behaving as a 70% party, is where that rubber meets the road, because as you saw, the ANC couldn't pass the budget, or it could barely pass the budget, and then had to go back to the drawing boards twice. And for the first time in South Africa's history, the budget failed and it was pulled by the government, and then had to go back, and there were 2 redrafts. And eventually, some of the requirements, not all of them, of the DA, which is the minority party, were referenced in that budget and in the tax tables that were published. So yes, there is a legal mechanism that exists in the way that Parliament it votes, and that doesn't depend on a coalition agreement. That depends on the parliamentary arithmetic.
What was the most surprising or revealing moment during the GNU negotiations that the public might not be aware of?
Well, it's all in my book, being there. There were a lot. I don't know which in particular. There were, people's public behavior is not always what they're saying in private, and I dealt with that in some detail. There was a lot of gamesmanship, maybe on both sides. There was a lot of outside pressure, which percolated into the chambers and houses and places we met in. This was high stakes stuff. It was nothing short of answering the question, who will govern South Africa? And the sub-question, can it be governed at all after last year's election? So there were a lot of perhaps unsurprising things that themselves were dramatic, and some surprising things that were equally dramatic, but which I detail.
Tony, thank you for that. I'm sure that the viewers and ourselves will all be reading your book. It sounds riveting and lots of political intrigue. Turning back to the question at hand, does the 14-day window, in your opinion, disadvantage smaller political parties who want to be part of the coalition talks? Because given the intense time constraints, I mean, we're talking 2 weeks after an election that you need to agree on and form a government. Larger parties, in my opinion, will probably be the ones that are dictating the terms. And do the smaller parties, they get a fair chance to be part of the negotiations?
Well, it entirely depends on the electoral outcome. If one party gets 47%, then there are small parties will much easier to do business with a couple of what we call rats and mice parties who don't come with too many demands except want some of the privileges and perks of office by being in the cabinet, then they'll have much more advantage. But the lower the major party did, the outcome disadvantages smaller parties because you can't really have a stable coalition unless you have a big partner. In this case, the DA was the only party that had over 20% of the vote, by the ANC. So that if the election outcome is of a specific kind, smaller parties will be advantaged. If it's of another kind, such as we had last May, then it's going to make smaller parties less relevant to creating a new government, because you could theoretically put 8 of those small parties into government, and the ANC might still struggle to get 50%. But you put in one like the DA, and that coalition's really got 62% of the votes, which obviously is good from a stability point of view, but means the ANC is going to have to make more concessions. I do need to just address this 14-day issue, since it's front and center of this discussion. Look, it's not everything it seems to be. So absolutely correct, and constitutionally, and this is what happened in practice, you have got 14 days to elect the president. So the DA took the view they were only going to vote for Ramaphosa's re-election if there was a substantive agreement governing how the government would operate, who would go into it, etc., etc. So that was what the wrangle or the negotiation was about. But we had not concluded any of the, in a way, harder negotiations, how many seats would be allocated to each party, who would be the personalities brought into government, which other parties would come into this coalition. There was simply an agreement on the basis of the statement of intent to vote Ramaphosa as president, Didiza as speaker, and Lotrit as deputy speaker. But the actual detailed negotiations of, who was going to get which prize, that was all left to the second phase, outside the 14 days, because you only needed to elect the president and the speaker. You didn't need to arrange the whole government. That came later. And that, frankly, is unlimited. I mean, Ramaphosa didn't have to announce the new cabinet 2 weeks afterwards. He could have done it 8 weeks afterwards or 10 weeks afterwards, but he did it about 2 weeks afterwards. So I think, it's important to note that you don't actually need an agreement beyond agreeing on who's going to be the president or the speaker. And obviously within that agreement is the background document on what basis did you vote for Mr. Ramaphosa and what do you get in exchange for your votes. But that then was left over, a lot of the detail, not the outline, the principle, to the second phase.
How do you think South Africa should view the 2024 GNU and the current state of South African democracy?
Surely. I mean, the GNU was formed apart from, saving well, you could say, when I say poorly, you could say it could be worse, which is perhaps not the most exciting response, but it is true. There were 2 fundamental reasons for the GNU. The negative reason was to keep out extremist, unconstitutional elements like the MK and the EFF. And you could say, in that rather negative sense, the GNU's been a success. But the positive reason, certainly from the DA point of view, and even in the statement of intent that everyone signed up to but hasn't done much about, it was to desperately try and reverse South Africa's low growth, high unemployment trajectory. And on that basis, the GNU's failed because the unemployment situation's worse than it was last May. and the growth rate has not budged to it's below 1%. And this is before we start factoring in what you call in economics exogenous factors like the Trump tariffs, although one could say even there, never mind the trying to get some coherent line of sight of what goes on in the White House, South Africa's, or the government, and in this case the ANC's, clinging to a foreign policy which has no place in the modern world, has aggravated South Africa's very difficult economic and trade relationships. And on that impact, just to answer your point, Lusanda, the government of national unity has had no impact at all, because the ANC has walled off foreign policy from anyone else. And we've seen the results, whether it's the chief of the defense force going to Iran, whether it's kowtowing to extreme anti-Western elements, whether it's basically misaligning, I think, South Africa's economic interests from its political posturing or vice versa. The GNU's had no impact on that at all. It's just been exactly, but worse than it was before when there was one-party rule. And there are number of other tent poles in the governing tent, such as BEE, such as state ownership of major swathes of the economy, which have not been reformed at all, despite the presence of non-ANC parties. And you would have seen or heard recently, 2 or 3 weeks ago, that at their National Executive Committee, no less a person than the president, Mr. Ramaphosa, said, the GNU is there to continue the national democratic revolution. Well, I can't speak for anyone, but I do know that the DA, which I led for many years and whose negotiations team I was in, do not subscribe to any part of the national democratic revolution. So you can draw your own conclusions.
And I know that you've now just laid out how the 14 days, yes, it's to negotiate a government, but not in the minutiae. How the 14 days is not all that everyone makes it out to be. You've stated various key pillars of the government, notably the foreign policy, the triple BEE, as well as the state-owned enterprises such as Eskom, etc. What are the reasons behind the ANC almost drawing an iron curtain, pardon the pun, over these areas and wanting to maintain exclusive control over them?
Well, I think it's self-evident. The ANC has a very self-righteous belief in its own cause and virtue, or whatever you might think of it. And I think they, in fact, during one stage of the negotiations, Fikile Mbalula put this out on Twitter or X, where he said, the GNU is the ANC's construction, and it's simply a tactic. They are not interested in sharing power. Even though they've got hammered at the polls, they're likely to, collapse further at the polls next year. They want to carry on as before, and they regard their so-called coalition partners, who's not really a coalition, they're not really treated as partners, as a necessary evil to allow the ANC continue. So, I mean, you can ask the question, you should ask it to the DA, what they're doing in this GNU. Well, the DA has taken a view they do control some ministries. They can affect some significant changes in some of those ministries. They're doing very well in some, not so well in others, but there it is. And that voters over time will take a better look at the party because it's actually governing, not just shouting on the sidelines. Even though it's got very limited powers in that government. And I think that's a calculation the party's made. And we'll see, because we have a set of local government elections next year, and in 4 years' time, we have a general election. So we'll see whether this gambit pays off or not.
How does the current GNU compare in terms of political culture, leadership, and public trust?
I mean, look, the first is this is a voluntary GNU. So this GNU was entered into by parties who were willing to enter into it. The previous GNU, the first one, the 94 one, was the result of the interim constitution, which mandated that parties that got a certain percentage were entitled to enter government and were allocated cabinet seats according to the percentage of votes they got. So ironically, the National Party did get a deputy presidency because that was also catered for. But with 20% of the votes, the National Party was a much smaller cabinet then, which is probably a very good thing. Only got 6 cabinet seats, same numbers the DA's got now, and plus a deputy presidency. And the ANC got, I don't know, about 15 cabinet seats, and then Carter got 2, I think, as I recall. So that was all determined by the election outcome. It had nothing to do, there were no agreements struck. It was Operation X Constitution, didn't rely on any bargaining at all. Of course, the allocation of the cabinet seats was a bargaining negotiation between Mandela and de Klerk. So that's very different to how this GNU was formed, because this was not mandated by the Constitution, it was mandated directly as a result of the election, and there were no provisions in the Constitution for this current GNU. Look, I think there are many differences apart from that obvious one. One is that South Africa was just bedding down a new constitutional arrangement, and in the period of the first GNU, which ended in 1996, a lot of Parliament's attention was taken with drafting the Constitution, the final Constitution. But I have to say, the National Party never managed to do 2 things. They were the equivalent of the DA today in terms of size. They never managed to get the ANC to enter an agreement on how the government would operate. So, because, I was from that era, I insisted this time, well, the DA did, but I helped bring this about, that we have to have a written agreement governing what's going to happen in the event of no agreement in cabinet, hence the statement of intent, which has been dishonored because it's never been operationalized. But at least we took the lessons of the past and tried to apply them in the agreement, the current agreement. The second thing, so F.W. de Klerk and the National Party were unsuccessful in pinning the ANC down. The DA was more successful this time, but the net result's the same, because the ANC doesn't like to be bound by agreements, or to enter agreements anyway if it doesn't have to. The second thing where I think the failure of the first GNU was that the National Party, and it really did to some extent depend on them, because they were the largest other party, the ANC being the ANC, never could successfully marry being a governing party and being an opposition. It just never got that mix correct. Now, you can argue, I know it's a subject of debate, that the DA has in a sense been more aggressive this time, in this government, in being both in the government and also being quite a strong opposition. So, they've launched a whole series of court challenges against policies, including cadre deployment, that they don't agree with, and they haven't allowed their membership of the government to muzzle that or to restrict their abilities. You might say, well, why is the ANC going along with it? Well, one can imagine that the ANC still, at the moment, might not last, wants the DA in more than it wants the DA out, but that might change. I know there were 2 reasons why the first GNU broke up. Well, the first was that the National Party in the final constitutional negotiations, NNP, put most of its eggs in the basket of power sharing, and they couldn't get the ANC to agree to extend the GNU's period after the first parliament, and that became a break point. So that was the essential reason why the National Party exited the GNU, and then that GNU failed. Well, it carried on in the sense, and there was the ANC and the IFP, but its original grand kind of tripartite basis was shattered by de Klerk's decision to withdraw. The second factor, and this is in F.W.'s book, The Last Great Trek, is where he said that he thought, as he experienced it, because he was ignored by Mandela, the interventions of the National Party cabinet ministers were bypassed, and he said continuation as government of national unity would have been the equivalent, as he wrote it, to be on a political death row. And therefore, he felt that the greater need of South Africa at the time would be to form a strong opposition. Well, of course, I think that was the correct call then, but the National Party weren't successful as being an opposition. We in the Democratic Party were. And then the rump of the National Party actually left the opposition cause and joined the ANC, which was a great irony of our times, but that's a matter of some old history now. So I think, without going into more detail, as I experienced, obviously there might be other views and other opinions, and they're fine, but that's how I saw the GNU Mark I and this GNU 2. And, you know, as I wrote in the book, being there now, we should have some regard for the lessons of the failure of the first GNU, because, you know, this GNU hasn't yet got to 2 years and it's just a lot of roadblocks. So let's see if it gets beyond 2 years.
Tony, and in terms of public trust and leadership, any notable differences in terms of the political culture that you would point out when it comes to those?
It was a very different parliament then, with very different characters and dynamics. Yes. Look, let's put it very simply. I mean, Cyril Ramaphosa is no Nelson Mandela, although Ramaphosa was very much involved in that early parliament in the constitutional negotiations. And I think a lot of the major figures of that era, I'll leave myself out of it, I was there, but I'm not talking about myself, were people, you know, who had enormous standing, and they came to public life with rich backgrounds, whether it was in the struggle or even the system. And I think to some extent, Parliament and political participation today has become a much more, I don't want to put this, you know, disparagingly, I say dumbed down, but, you know, we've got now people who've got no background except as professional politicians. And I think that's a limiting factor. I think, you know, if I look at most of those cabinet, but obviously most of the cabinet ministers had never been allowed to vote until the 94 election. They'd all been somewhere else. Many of them had been in jail, but others had, you know, been advocates. They'd been struggle activists. They'd, in the case of Pravin Gordon, been a pharmacist. I mean, they had professions. And on the other side of the aisle, my party, we had only 7 MPs, but everyone, me, I'd been an attorney, someone else, another colleague, an attorney, one was a headmaster, one was a business guy, so one had been a newspaper editor. So everyone had a richer background in which to bring to the public discourse. And I can't emphasize how important I think that is. You know, people complain about politicians' economic literacy or lack of literacy. A lot of it is because a lot of them have done nothing except be politicians. So you're not going to learn the whole world through the political party process. You need some outside experience or qualification. So I think that was one aspect of that parliament. The second is genuinely, and obviously there were always going to be problems and debates and issues. I think there was a sense of, I would say, wonderment. I mean, these were, you know, quite hardened politicians, but acknowledgement of how unique the moment was and how special South Africa's achievement became. It wasn't just that we felt that in that first parliament, it was the whole world arrived, you know, from Queen Elizabeth II to President Clinton to President Mitterrand of France. Everyone wanted to come and experience and participate. Well, obviously Mandela was a huge draw card, but the South African miracle, the negotiated revolution, or the revolution that wasn't, but which was negotiated in the end. And it really gave a sense of hope, not just to the, you know, 400 of us elected to that parliament in 94, but to the wider world. And I think South Africa was seen as a very special place with a very special sense of achievement. Well, I think we've squandered a great deal of that goodwill, both internally and externally since.
The FW de Klerk Foundation has expressed concern about unstable coalitions. You've expressed you don't believe South Africa needs law to better regulate political coalitions. Do you believe political majority is the missing ingredient?
It isn't the absence of an agreement with tangible operational clauses that's caused the governance problem. It's the lack of will, largely, and one must call a spade by the ANC, because they are the majority party in cabinet, and they control the presidency, to actually be bound by the commitments they made. So if you're going to stuff in a whole lot more clauses or into regulations or legislation, but you have the same mindset, I think you can expect no difference in terms of the outcome, my view.
That's it for today's episode of The Constitution at Work. A huge thank you to you, Tony Leon, for taking time out of your busy schedule to talk to us about the GNU, the 14-day window, and the behind-the-scenes drama that shaped South Africa's political future. To our viewers, if you found this conversation valuable, please subscribe, leave a review, and share it with someone who cares about the future of our democracy. Thanks for listening.